Chapter 25 of Harvests, Part 1. Harvest. The Flying City. When Anatami was a filly, she'd asked her father why ponies had given the city such an odd nickname. Didn't all cities fly? And all the farms and the forests and everything else in the world? What was it about this city in particular that made it the flying city? And he just smiled and ruffled her mane with a wing and told her that she'd understand once she saw the city herself. Years passed between her rare visits to Harvest, but the effect it had on her as it crested the horizon was always the same. The city got its name a long time ago, when it was less city and more farmland, but its central location relative to the rest of Equestria had drawn in merchants and crafts ponies aplenty. It was just a matter of time before the trading post established on its coast began to expand, eating up more and more land with every passing year. When they ran out of forests and farms, Harvest expanded vertically, blazing a path that all other city islands would follow in the future. Towers were erected and mines were dug, and as the mines ran dry, they were carved into homes for the miners to live in as they dug ever deeper. A wave of urbanization crawling inexorably towards the bottom of the island. And then, one day, after hundreds of years of growth, there was no land left to dig into. Highton was a city built on flying islands, and Baltimore was a city that had taken flight, but Harvest, more than anywhere else in Equestria, was truly a flying city. Anna reclaimed in a hammock she'd set up on the stern of the trade ship that had carried her and Gava from Friesland, shaded from the dawning sun by the ship's hull, and watched the urban sprawl slide past beneath her. There were places where she could see straight through to the ocean, gaps in the island that snaked through the city like invisible rivers, crisscrossed by bridges large and small. She had heard that some of the larger mines had never been built back up, leaving behind huge hollow chambers deep in the city that were rented out to wealthy families in the middling levels, or used as warehouses, hiding away great stores of wood or precious metals that were traded back and forth for decades without ever being moved. Unlike Highton, the streets on the surface of Harvest were kept clean and open. The rich here valued space more than anything. Business was conducted underground, and heavier industry was shipped abroad.
And even they live in shadow.
The corner of her lip pulled up into a wry smile as she watched the shadow of her ship flicker across the architecture. Just one hard-edged shape among 100 others. Airships came here from across Equestria, and there simply wasn't room to process them all around the coast. So many ships docked at the freight towers that jutted out either above or below the city. She had heard it said that the roofs didn't even get rain in Harvest. The airships were thicker than the clouds.
Anna, you out here?
Gava glided down around the curve of the hull, hovering next to the hammock. She had the chest with their father's skull, and Rardy's dress, tied snugly on her back between two saddlebags. Anna greeted her with a lazy wave.
Hey sis, wanna sit and city gaze with me?
Gava clacked her beak.
Ship will be docking now. I don't want to deal with ponies poking their hooves in our stuff. Why not?
Anna grinned.
It can't be that expensive to bribe an old skull past customs, right?
Gava rolled her eyes.
Do you know how addresses work in this dump? Missing that barren land air already, huh?
Anna grinned at her sister's scowl as she slid into her own saddlebags and stood, stretching her wings.
All right, Big Bird. Let's get this over with.
She stepped into open air, enjoying a few seconds of free fall before snapping her wings open and settling into an easy glide. She twitched an ear, catching the sound of Gava's heavier wing beats behind her, and aimed for the nearest chasm. Anna wasn't especially familiar with Harvest's layout, but she knew the basics. There were 3 main layers where the city was mostly contiguous, and the streets were mostly flat. One being the surface, the largest right in the middle, and a smaller one near the bottom, where the island's original structure started to taper. Merchants and administrators lived in those areas, and they ensured it was easy to travel within and between them for their own convenience. But then there was the rest of the city. A hodgepodge puzzle carved out of or around old mine shafts and natural caves. It was never obvious how to get anywhere in that mess. Ponies lived or worked in little pockets of architecture, often walled off from immediate neighbors while being connected to others via tunnel. And the city didn't care to enforce such frivolities as street signs or building codes. As Anna drifted down into one of the island's urban chasms and descended past the tightly packed makeshift homes built into the walls, she wondered if there were ponies that died in this city without ever seeing the moon. The chasm widened sharply as they reached the central layer. Anna pulled up, hovering in place and turning in a slow circle above a bridge crowded with ponies. The bridge connected 2 wide avenues, bathed in a warm orange glow by ever-burning lanterns hanging sporadically from any available surface. Ponies walked in and out of buildings that merged right into the walls, less built up than dug out, or sometimes slipped away into claustrophobic tunnels that Anna guessed took them to other streets, the sounds of their hooves and the smell of their sweat filling the stuffy air. They were lucky that the address Whitehorn had given them was in the central layer, as Anna didn't like her odds of exploring the labyrinthian outskirts. After landing and spending an annoyingly long time trying to find a pony brave enough to give them directions, it only took a bit over 10 minutes to find the place.
A bank?
Gava landed heavily next to Anna, paying no mind to the ponies who scuttled away from the duo. The bank looked much like most of the other buildings down here, as though a sculptor had carved a life-sized picture of a building face into the cavern wall before hiring a team of miners to dig it out. The stone was painted in polite blues and whites, while a long gilded wood sign hung above the door, claiming 12 feet on either side with its frame. 7th Harvest Central Bank.
We're meeting him in a bank? I don't mind,
Anna said, already starting for the doorway.
Maybe I can find a few bonus payments lying around.
The entrance hall split around a wall that greeted potential customers with a colorful mural of fish swimming around a sunken ship, muffling the bustle of the street and granting the interior a more private, subdued air. Anna hadn't been to many banks since her youth. She had had some poor interactions with them as a filly, but somehow they all looked the same on the inside. Short row of teller booths, bland sofas that were never used, and a pair of recessed offices to one side for customers to figure out the details of how they wanted to indebt themselves for life. She looked it all over with a discerning eye, noting the fearful or shocked looks turned towards her and her sister.
Miss Anatami? Miss Gava?
An aging Pegasus mare with a pale green coat and a tired smile stepped up to greet them.
Who are you?
Anna asked. From the look on the mare's face, she guessed that Gava was doing something menacing behind her.
We're here to see Whitehorn. My name is Fritzy. Mr. Whitehorn hasn't arrived yet, and I'm to handle you until he does. If you would please come with me?
Handle us?
Gava asked.
We still don't have a signed contract. How's it going to get us that when he isn't even here?
We can settle the contract now, ma'am,
Fritzy said, turning leadingly towards a door at the far end of the room.
But not in the lobby.
Ma'am? Oh!
Anna chuckled but waved the mare on.
I can't remember the last time I heard someone call her that.
Fritzy forced her smile a little wider, making a bad attempt at a grin before walking for the door. She held it open for Anna and Gava, shutting it quietly behind them as they stepped into a narrow, sparingly lit hall.
There's a staircase at the back.
Anna followed the hall at a relaxed pace, ears perked and listening for activity behind the closed doors on either side. She heard the jingling of bits from one, and a hoof being stomped in anger from another, and the muffled shouting from the door next to the stairs was loud enough that she paused to listen.
It's not fair! I've banked here for 10 years, paying every month without fail. But we both know I can't meet the new rate. You're putting me out of business! Your previous rate was not set in stone, Mr. Strikes. It's within the bank's right to change it. Like Tartarus it is! Where's Sunrise Venture? She and I had an understanding. You tell her, Mr. Strikes, Mrs. Venture hasn't headed this branch since the riots 2 months ago, and Mr. Goose only takes meetings by appointment.
Anna pursed her lips thoughtfully as she started up the stairs.
New management, huh?
And now Whitehorn was arranging meetings with mercenaries in the back of the bank. The door at the top of the stairs opened onto a square, mostly empty room with a single potted plant drooping sadly in one corner. Each wall had an unlabeled door set into it, and Fritzy, after squeezing past Anna and Gava with some quietly muttered apologies, went for the one opposite.
Mr. Goose?
Fritzy called, opening the door without knocking.
Your new guests are here.
The door led to a wide, important-looking office dominated by a wide, messy desk. Behind the desk sat a yellow Pegasus stallion that was grimacing down at a pile of papers through thick-rimmed square spectacles. He jumped, eyes darting up to the doorway, and adjusted the loose tie around his neck as he set the papers aside.
More? Already? Is that a problem?
Fritzy stepped fully into the office, nodding to Anna and Gava as they followed.
This is Miss Anatami and Miss Gava. They'll be staying in your spare room.
Mr. Goose's eyes widened, and he looked slowly between the two sisters with obvious trepidation.
Those are...
Yeah.
Gava cut him off with a flick of her tail.
What about it?
Nothing.
The stallion waved his hooves in what Anna imagined was supposed to be a placating way, but to her it looked more like he was trying to flag for help.
There's no issue, though I only have one bed.
Oh, don't you worry about that, cutie.
Anna grinned, flashing him her fangs.
We'll let you know if there's a problem.
His mouth flapped uselessly for a few seconds, confusion joining the anxiety on his face. Finally, Fritzy gave a slight, judgmental shake of her head before beckoning Anna and Gava out of the room. Gava followed right away, but Anna paused in the doorway, glancing back and spotting the hoof-written name card propped up on his desk. Mr. Swoose Goose, branch head. Fritzy led them to one of the other rooms, which looked more like living space than an office, and Anna's gaze immediately went to the bed in the center.
One bed, my plot?
The thing was bigger than any bed she'd slept on in years, taking up half the room. An attached kitchen, not just a kitchenette, but an actual full kitchen, could be seen through an open doorway, and there was another door that Anna assumed led to a bathroom. Fritzy grabbed one of the lanterns from the adjoining room in a wing, using it to light the one spread evenly around the suite. That done, she set the lantern aside, reached into a folder tucked under a wing, and pulled out a pair of pristine white papers.
Here is your contract,
she said, holding it out. There was a simple wood table at the foot of the bed, and Anna exchanged a quick glance with her sister before dropping her bags, grabbing the contract, and sliding it onto the table. The text was dense, but surprisingly short, and Anna had made it her business to be familiar with such fare since her father passed. Fritzy waited patiently by the door, and after shrugging off her luggage, Gava paced impatiently in the kitchen, so Anna was free to read in relative peace. Anna and Gava had worked under contract before, and the types of ponies that wrote them seemed to usually take great joy in outlining every possible way that they tied you down and restricted your freedom, using as many words as possible. It was odd, then, that this contract was only 1 page and actually had more space devoted to outlining compensation than potential punishments. In a way, it didn't feel like Whitehorn was really employing them, so much as he was just reserving the right to hire them first, but otherwise allowing them to operate where and how they wished. It made Anna suspicious. She read it over 3 more times, pausing after every sentence and rephrasing it in her head to make sure she was understanding it right, and yet no red flags were raised. She looked down to his signature at the bottom of the page, smooth and styled.
How did he sign this?
She asked, looking up.
You said he's not on harvest yet. It's a form contract,
Fritzy said.
Is there an issue?
Anna frowned but shook her head.
It seems too good to be true. Mr. Whitehorn prefers to let his contractors work with the freedom to best employ their talents when possible,
Fritzy explained, glancing to Gava.
If everything is acceptable, then please sign. I have an assignment for you.
Already?
Gava asked suspiciously.
We just got here.
Fritzy pursed her lips.
Please, sign.
Anna sighed and returned her attention to the contract. As much as they'd pushed earlier to get a proper written contract before continuing to work for Whitehorn, now that she was here, she couldn't help but have second thoughts. She had the gut feeling there wouldn't be any going back after this. Ponies were never happy with the initial terms of a contract. They always pushed for more, tried to twist the words and add more and tie you down and make you theirs. She glanced up to Gava and saw the griffin watching her with a curious frown. Gava was trusting her to make the right choice here. And Anna had never been a mare to make choices with her gut. She was a mare that thought things through and measured the facts and weighed the odds, and right now, as far as she could reason, everything was in their favor. And at the very worst, even if they did end up tied down without the means to break out and return to their old life, well, at least they would still be together. And that was the thing that mattered. Anna lifted a wing, grabbing the pen waiting on the table and clicking it open. She signed quickly, with both their names, and then again on the second copy.
Thank you.
Fritzy grabbed one copy and returned it to the folder under her wing. In almost the same motion, she pulled out a different sheet, placing it down on the table.
Your first job.
Anna cocked her head, and Gava patted over to lean over her shoulder. The sheet had a sketch of a unicorn mare on it, her confident smirk rendered in grayscale charcoal. Small text in the corner described the mare's colors and name. Sapphire Swing. Gava grunted.
You want us to kill this pony?
Fritzy arched a brow.
Please don't. She's a member of the Harvest delegation for Parliament, and her death would be unfortunate for Mr. Whitehorn. We need you to threaten her.
Oh, I get it.
Anna nodded.
She's stepping out of line, huh? Mrs. Swing and Mr. Whitehorn have a deal, and she merely requires a reminder of the consequences of reneging on that deal,
Fritzy said.
She's currently staying aboard a ship on the South End, the Dragon Scale, and has threatened to withdraw her support unless Mr. Whitehorn opens to a renegotiation. You need to board the ship, find her lodgings, and remind her why that's a bad idea. Seems simple enough.
Anna looked to Gava, exchanging nods before turning back to Fritzy.
And what's with the banker? Should we be worried about him? Mr. Goose is well under control,
Fritzy said.
He won't tell anyone you're staying here. At least, not without a certain amount of physical persuasion. Got it. Whitehorn must have some strong dirt on him.
She turned to Fritzy with a playful smirk.
Anything else? It's extra if you want to share the bed.
Fritzy frowned but shook her head.
I'll be back in a week at most. And remember, don't kill her.
Anna put on her most unnerving smile, all sharp teeth and wide, slitted eyes.
We'll do our best.
The door shut with a quiet click, leaving the sisters alone, and Anna let the fake smile fall. She looked down to the drawing of their target with a tired sigh, then back up to Gava.
Do you think they sell fish here?
They called themselves the Crystal Empire. Twilight had always been fascinated by the unwritten meaning of words, sometimes far removed from how they were described in the dictionary. Empire had fallen out of use long before Twilight's time, but she had seen it many times in her textbooks. It summoned images of long, well-patrolled roads binding different cultures hundreds of miles apart, grand palaces where the greatest wonders from around the world were gathered in displays of prestige, and sometimes legions of soldiers marching in lockstep on the way to expand their borders. The last recorded instance was the Griffonian Empire, and some scholars debated the existence of an Equestrian Empire far in the past, but never once had Twilight read anything, anywhere, about a Crystal Empire. Her thoughts lingered on this mystery as she and Midnight wandered through the drowned streets, Scylla scuttling a few steps ahead. How did one hide an entire empire from history, and why? Perhaps some vengeful rival had burned every mention of their existence after defeating them in a bloody war? Had they hidden themselves, ashamed after committing some terrible sin? Or maybe the Crystal Ponies were merely following the tradition started by some delusional ancestor, referring to themselves as an empire when in truth they were nothing more than a lonely far northern settlement.
Unlikely.
Twilight shook her head, looking back up to the palace and admiring the way it channeled and radiated the sunlight from above. An isolated township couldn't make something like that. It would have required many skilled architects and crafts ponies and arcanists, more than a small community could provide.
And the soldiers, too.
Midnight guided her gaze towards one of the crystallized ponies, his body protected with the battered barding, locked in combat, with a rival armored in dark angular plating. They walked up to the pair, and Twilight picked up a weathered helmet half buried in the sand.
There are hundreds on both sides. Great powers battle here. How long have they been frozen here?
Twilight wondered, turning the helmet over in her hooves.
If I had come here as a filly, what would I have found? An insignificant question, and not what we came here for.
Twilight pursed her lips, her eyes wandering until they found the gaze of one of the frozen soldiers. He looked so animated, his face contorted with such fury that she could almost believe he was still alive, miraculously preserved in much the same way she and her friends had been. Perhaps he was even still conscious, looking out at her, silently begging for rescue. She shivered at the thought. She had spent her time in the dark unconscious, blissfully unaware, as her world drowned all around her. She couldn't even imagine what it would be like to be trapped in crystal for such a time. She shook her head, focusing back on his horn. Most of the horns she had seen in her travels had been weathered and chipped, often already separated from the skull of their owner or crumbling into dust, but this one had been perfectly preserved by its crystal casing. She wrapped it tightly in her magic, cringing as she began to pull, but it didn't budge. Midnight sighed, seizing control of their magic, and Twilight flinched as the horn broke free with a sickening snap. Little pieces of crystal sparkled in her hornlight as they fell to the half-buried street.
You must pull swiftly and at once, little flower,
Midnight chided.
Bones do not break to hesitation.
After a few seconds, Twilight let out the breath she had been holding. It had happened so fast. For some reason, she was expecting more. But there was nothing. No creature was roused by the deep crunch of thick bone breaking, and no ghost jumped out to haunt her for disturbing its grave. The ocean rumbled carelessly around her as she held the chunk of crystallized horn in her lavender glow. With a grimace and a burst of energy, Twilight crushed it in her magic. There was a sound like grinding teeth, and the horn was reduced to a small orb of pale, white rock, the crushed crystal in the mass emanating a rainbow shimmer as it rotated in Twilight's magic.
Impressive,
Midnight mused.
I'd expected you to balk at such work.
Twilight took a deep breath, waiting for her pulse to slow back to normal.
I'm not as weak as you think.
Midnight's smile hovered in the center of her vision.
I know. You're not as weak as you think.
Twilight let the small ball of hornbane hover beside her as she walked from body to body, breaking her grim trophies free and grinding them up with bursts of magic. She moved stiffly, almost in a trance, her mind dancing around what she was doing as her ball of stolen bone powder grew steadily larger. Was she a bad pony? She kept thinking back to when she'd made this decision with Midnight, reminding herself that she wasn't hurting anyone. These were just empty bodies, abandoned, as inert as any rock. It felt wrong, but she had learned by now that her gut instinct on right and wrong couldn't always be trusted. She had thought it through herself, and she knew that the sense of unease would pass with time and repetition, just like when she had started eating meat. She took some comfort in that, but there was another thing bothering her.
What if Rainbow asks how we made this?
She asked as she passed through a line of frozen soldiers, plucking a pair of horns from their owners. A crystallized father and foal hunched down behind the formation, and Twilight was glad they weren't unicorns.
She may not understand. She is unlikely to ask. Curiosity is not in her nature. But what if she does?
Twilight insisted.
We should have a plan.
They worked in silence for some moments. Twilight passed under a crystal arch and came out into the courtyard of a small villa. There were skeletons here, washed up against the columns on either side. But she was more interested in the two soldiers locked in combat beside the entrance. Their horns came free with sharp cracks.
Are you suggesting that we lie?
Twilight stopped. She kept her eyes on the ball of hornbane, now larger than the bottom of her hoof.
She wouldn't understand this. She would think I'm a monster. Lying is for cowards.
Midnight's growl echoed in her ears.
And we are not cowards. Are you sure?
Twilight bit her lip, looking back to meet Midnight's glower.
I'm afraid of losing her.
Midnight's brow furrowed in thought, and after a few seconds she spoke, her words slow and measured.
We will always be Rainbow Dash's friends, even if she thinks it otherwise.
Twilight sighed. She knew that her friend's trust in her was tenuous at best, and the idea of losing that trust terrified her more than anything she had ever faced. But she knew that lying would only make things worse. If Rainbow asked her about the nature of the arcane prosthetic, then Twilight would be honest, no matter how much it might hurt their relationship. She'd just have to hope that any damage could be repaired with time. Still, she hoped it wouldn't come to that. A broken friendship could be harder to heal than a lost eye, and a lost eye was painful enough.
This should be enough material.
Twilight closed her eyes, calling Skilla back to her and gathering her magic to teleport.
Let's get this over with.
With the crack of magic and a rush of water, she left the ruins behind.